So the purpose of this video is to try and nail down a more solid timeline for when Chris Sterns travelled up to Orlando and then Stephan Sterns travelled down to Northport, because there's been so many contradictions when it comes to interviews and stuff. Now, I don't know how much bearing this has on the case, but on the surface it actually does raise a few interesting questions for me. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to try and figure out what's going on here in terms of the different times that were given, mainly by Chris Sterns, but I'm also looking at some documentation as well. So to me it makes the most sense to start with the solid information that we have. So the stuff that has been verified, and this is verified from license plate readers. So I'm just going to read through it and then point out the important things, and then I've done a map to show you just how close this is to Stephan's parents' house. So on the 28th of February 2024, at approximately 6:29 hours, Jen's vehicle was captured on a license plate reader at the intersection of North Cranberry Boulevard and Toledo Blade Boulevard, which is in Northport, Florida. This location is approximately 1 mile from Stephan's parents' residence at this address, Northport, who he's been residing with since December 2023. Jen's vehicle is then captured on the same tag reader again at 7:46 hours. At approximately 10:21 hours, Jen's vehicle then hits on a license plate reader at the intersection of Rolling Oaks Boulevard and 129 in Kissimmee. At approximately 10:57 hours, information is obtained that Stephan then arrives in Jen's vehicle to the hotel room in which they were staying while the search warrant was being conducted on their residence. So the important times to note there are that he is basically recorded approximately a mile from their residence at 6:29 in the morning, and then about a bit over an hour and a quarter later, he's then recorded in the same location at 7:46. So he was there for over an hour, and it appears that he was at their house in Northport, Florida for over an hour. And then we have him back in Kissimmee at 10:21 and back at the hotel at 10:57. So they're the significant times that we need to keep in mind when we're looking at the rest of this. And I'm actually going to revisit this at the end of the video and look at a few things that to me are somewhat interesting. Now I'm just going to bring up the map for a moment just to show you how close it was to his parents' house. But I also want to point out something interesting, and that is, now I can't say that this is the exact route that he used to get from where he was caught on camera to his parents' house, but to me it seems like the most direct route, and more interestingly, that particular route passes very few houses. So there's a lot of undeveloped blocks between the location where he was caught on a tag reader and his parents' house. So that's probably why there's no other evidence of him having reached his parents' house. But I do believe, I feel totally confident that he did in fact go to his parents' house, and I also feel totally confident that he entered his parents' house. I've discussed this in a few videos. It relates to the missing hard drive from the computer in his room. Essentially, at the end of the day, someone removed that hard drive after he had left to go to Kissimmee on the Sunday. We have, in his own father's words, that he was on that computer just before he left on the Sunday. And yet, when Chris Stearns handed it over to police, there was no hard drive in that computer. So either Stephan Sterns entered the residence during this 1 and a bit hours that he was there, or Deb or Chris removed the hard drive. Personally, given that Chris handed over a USB with over 30,000 images on it, I can't see why he would bother to remove the hard drive and destroy it. So my money is definitely on Stephan having entered the house. I also believe that that was done via the rear of the house, which you'll note that Chris Stearns is very careful to avoid discussing. Okay, so I'm going to start breaking down the timeline now based on Chris Stearns' own interviews and see if I can make it all add up.
So, what time did you get here last night?
3 a.m.
3 a.m. When you got here, where did you meet your son and Jennifer?
We apparently pulled up at the same time at the hotel.
Perfect. Okay. When you guys got there, what did you guys end up doing?
We checked into the rooms. They had 239. I had 203. Opposite ends of the building. I brought my stuff up, went over and said goodnight, and then hit the sack.
So here we have all three of them arriving at the hotel at the same time, all checking in at the same time, and that is at 3 a.m. in the morning. And then supposedly they checked into their rooms, he popped in to say goodnight, and then they all went to bed. So to me, popping in to say goodnight is maybe spending 10 minutes in the room, and then everyone heads off to bed, right? Now bear in mind that this is the interview that was done on the same day that he had been at the hotel, meaning that this should have been clearest in his mind in this interview. He should have the most solid notion of the time frame in this interview you would expect.
What time did the dogs go full alert last night? 3:19.
3:19 a.m.?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so we have this time of 3:19 when their dogs supposedly went on full alert. And when you go through the documents, you can see that this is the time that Deb Sterns also reported to Northport PD when they went and spoke to her. She said, yes, the dogs were on full alert at 3:19. Now we know that Stephan definitely was not at the house at 3:19. So we know that this is totally irrelevant. And Chris Stearns would know that that is totally irrelevant. So I'm not sure why he brought it up in the first place, because it couldn't possibly fit with the timeline. Even if, as we later discover, he had arrived at Kissimmee earlier than 3 a.m. It still wouldn't work for the timeline for Stephan Sterns. So is it an intended red herring? Well, no, Stephan didn't go to the house because the dogs alerted at 3:19, and that would be far too early for him to have been there. What if the dogs don't alert when Stephan goes to the house? in all their interviews, and especially in the one that they did with Hidden True Crime, Deb and Chris talk about how Stephan had this real empathy with animals. So who's to say that he was not able to enter that house without the dogs going on full alert? My theory, as I've mentioned in several videos, is that when he went down to the house, he actually entered through the back door. Because, as we know, the front door was disabled. Supposedly, the keypad suddenly wasn't working, and supposedly you couldn't get in through the garage without a clicker, which Stephan didn't have. So it is my belief that he entered the house through the back door. Now, I've locked myself out of my house a few times. And because if I'm out and the dogs are home, I don't worry about locking the back door before I go out. I mean, this is Bendigo, it's a pretty safe area. So there's been times when I've locked myself out of the house, or if perhaps it's been a bit wet and the front door lock isn't working properly, and I've had to go in the back door. And my dogs don't react when I go in the back door, because it's a complete change from their routine. So I could be in the kitchen bumbling around doing stuff, and until I make enough noise for them to realise I'm there, they're going to be sitting in my bedroom, which is at the front of the house, waiting to hear me come in through the front door so that they can greet me. Now, Deb Sterns has said the dogs were all in with me. She's also said that there was a disturbance at 3:19 in the morning. So, did she have the dogs shut in her room with her? Because then, chances are, if he went in quietly enough and he went in the back door, they may not have even noticed that he was there. But I'm going to come back to that at the end of this video, because there's something I noticed with regards to this time frame.
How long did it take you to get from Orlando to there?
Well, with no traffic out last night, 2.5 hours.
Okay.
But if you're dealing with traffic early this morning, you're going to be looking at close to 3.
So, based on Google research, and when it comes to looking for times and distances, you can be pretty accurate with looking up those kind of things on Google. Based on that, I would say that when he's saying close to 3, he's talking about peak hour traffic. Because if you have a look in Google and you put in their address, and then you put in the location of the hotel, then it should, in normal traffic, take 2.5 hours. Meaning that if you are travelling in the middle of the night, it's probably going to take less than 2.5 hours, because you're not going to encounter any delays, theoretically. So let's put a pin in 2.5 hours as being roughly the amount of time that it takes to get from their house in Northport to the hotel in Kissimmee.
When I left him at 3 o'clock, you know, you could see that he was physically exhausted and worn out.
Okay, it's not hugely significant, but you have a shift in the timeline here. So he says originally that he arrived at the hotel at 3 a.m, unloaded his bags, then he went and said goodnight to Jen and Stephan, and then they all went their merry ways and went to bed and went to sleep. But here he's saying, when I left him at 3 a.m, which would say that he actually got there earlier than 3 a.m, and that they were parting ways at 3 a.m, that Chris Stearns went to bed at 3 a.m, not that he arrived at 3 a.m. So this is probably insignificant. It's probably using approximations here. But it is the first shift in the timeline, so I did just want to make note of that.
10:45, she calls and said, "Is Stephan with you?" And I go, "No."
Yeah.
He said, "Well, he hasn't been here for 25 minutes.
And that's probably, I'm assuming, like she woke up, it's been 25 minutes, and he hadn't shown up.
Yeah, expecting him to return, and he never returned.
Yeah.
And then he showed up maybe towards 11:30. Yeah, maybe it was like 11:30.
Now, I'm not really sure what to think about this timeline difference here, because according to the records, Stephan actually turned up again at 3 minutes to 11 at the hotel. And yet, according to Chris, he turned up at 11:30. Did Stephan get back into the car park and then not connect up with Chris until 11:30? And did he, if that is the case, did he connect with Jen before then? Or did he connect with neither of them until 11:30? Or is it that Chris Stearns just really isn't any good with figuring out timelines, and that he's just got himself really confused? Interesting, because in later interviews he is very particular about times, because he uses data from his phone to pinpoint times. So let's see if that does change in the subsequent interviews.
So,
How long did it take you to get up here last night?
Pretty good time.
When you say pretty good time,
There's no traffic.
so what?
None on 75 and nothing on, so I think I got up here, I'm definitely under 3 hours, but I would say at least 2.5 hours. Trying to figure out where we were going to stay because had no idea. So we found the place out there off of Western Parkway. So I think I left around midnight and got up here 2:45-ish.
So again, we have the timeline shifting. So he's saying that he left around midnight and that he got there around 2:45. So he's saying that it took him 2 3/4 hours to get there. Now I'm going to say that it didn't take him 2 3/4 hours to get there. So he still hasn't really fixed the timeline here yet. Either he left later than midnight or he arrived earlier than 2:45. So I'm not sure why it is that he's having so much trouble figuring out his timeline. I could understand you giving an approximate time and sticking with that approximate time. But this is the same interview. And he started off saying he arrived around 3, and now in the same interview, he's shifted the goalposts twice. He said he arrived around 3, and then he said that Stephan had gone to bed around 3, meaning that he had to have arrived earlier, and now he's saying he arrived at 2:45, which I guess would fit with him having seen Stephan last at 3. So maybe that is getting a bit closer to a more accurate timeline, perhaps.
And I may have been partially asleep because I had my phone on silent, and then I woke up because the phone was vibrating, and then my watch would have been in the office. So the phone was vibrating. By the time I got it, there was no connect. So then that was at 10:42, and then I made an out call at 10:43, and then the conversation was about, you need to come up here.
And who says that?
They both did because they were on speaker.
Okay.
And Stephan said, "Hey, you need to come up here." And I said, "Okay." I said, so we discussed, they were being kicked out. They didn't have a place to stay. So I said, well, we need to figure out where to go for, where to stay, what have you. And so I'm jumping in the shower, packing a bag, talking to Deb, making plans to leave, which I did it just after midnight. I tried to make a call to them at 11:56. It went to voicemail, and then I called her back at, now we're into Wednesday, so I called her back at 12 to let them know I was on my way.
Okay, so here we're into the second interview, where he's actually using phone calls to narrow down the timeline. So we can say with confidence that he left Northport at around 12 in the morning. He says he rang Jen just before 12, and we know that she was still in her interview with police at that stage. So at 11:56, which is I think when he said he rang her, she was still in the interview with police, and they were just starting to inform her that she couldn't go back into the apartment. So it's interesting that he's saying that they had rang him an hour before that. So they actually phoned him before her interview with police, which means that the plans for him to go to Orlando had been made before Jen was told in that interview, yeah, we're locking down your apartment, you can't go back in. So that's quite interesting to me. And I've already shown in other videos that it wasn't about him getting them into a hotel because they paid for themselves. He reimbursed them the cost of the money for getting the dog into the hotel as well. But in terms of paying for them to be in the hotel, they didn't need him there in the middle of the night to do that. But back to the timeline. So here we have him saying that he left at 12. So that narrows in the timeline again. He is saying that he rang them at around that time to say he was on his way, which to me would say, when you say that you rang someone as, you ring them as you are leaving, meaning that either you do it hands-free before you start the car, or you set up your phone, you start the car, and then you do it hands-free as you are starting to leave. So I think we can narrow in his time for leaving to around 12 in the morning. If he arrived, as he said, at 2:45, that's roughly 2.5 hours driving, which in normal traffic conditions is what you would expect. Early hours of the morning, you would expect it to take far less time. So I think there's still something not quite adding up here with the timeline.
And then I got a call from them at 1:18, lasted for 2 minutes, and then at 1:51, 50 seconds, because I arrived at the hotel.
What were the conversation at the 118 area? What was that conversation about?
Just confirmation of where they were and where we were staying and the address of the hotel, because it was out off of west of Disney off the 429.
Okay, so he's contradicting his own timeline here in a few spots. First of all, he had originally said that he arrived at the hotel at the same time as Jen and Stephan. And that would work if we're supposed to believe that with Jen's story that he paid for their hotel room. But now he's saying that they rang him at 1:18 to let him know where they were, where the hotel was, where they were all staying, meaning that they were at the hotel half an hour before him, over half an hour before him. And when did he arrive? So here he's saying he arrived at 1:51. That's almost an hour earlier than when he originally said he arrived. So he said he arrived, first of all, he said he arrived around 3, then he arrived around 2:45. Now he's saying, based on his phone calls, that they rang him at 1:51 and the phone call was terminated because that's when he arrived at the hotel. That means he made really good time from Northport to the hotel, because that means that he got there in under 2 hours, which is possibly why he has been so evasive about the timeline, because he doesn't want to admit that he was speeding. And to have knocked that much time, if an average drive is 2.5 hours, He's knocked about 40 minutes off that average drive time. Even with no traffic, that means you're going to be making really, really good time, meaning he had to have been well over the speed limit. So perhaps that is the only explanation for him actually being really vague with his timeline.
And Stephan, I'm assuming.
Yeah, we were just greeting, gave Stephan a hug and, chit-chatted for a few minutes. I was busy checking in because they had already completed their check-in. They went up to their room. They were on the opposite end of me, but we were on the same floor. I went out to the car to, park my car, get my stuff and bring it in and go to my room. And then I went to their room, spent about 10 minutes with them, no more than 15, and then I was heading back to my room to go to bed.
So this seems consistent with his story of basically popping in to say goodnight to them. So going in and talking to them for 10-15 minutes and then going to bed. So I guess if we allow time for check-in, allow time for taking bags to his room, then maybe at the latest 2:30 that he headed off to his own room and went to bed, perhaps. It would be hard. You'd need to know how long it would take. You'd need to know in terms of where in the hotel he was, how long the check-in process was. But if we're adding, say, 20 minutes for check-in and to take stuff to the hotel, that would take us to 10 past, 2:15, add another 10-15 minutes. So yeah, roughly 2:30. Possibly that's when he was headed to bed. That seems consistent with what he was saying about only popping in to say goodnight to them at this point in time. But it's definitely changing the timeline away from that 3 o'clock time that he originally said. And I suspect that it is just that maybe he's not as conscious of the times as earlier on, he wasn't as conscious of the times, whereas now he's looking at his phone calls, which can give him a better idea of times.
More interviews or what have you. I plan to go to the office. Our corporate office is in Orlando, so I plan to go. So I was up 6:30, 7 or so. 6:30. Then I left the hotel around 7:30 to go to the office.
Okay. When you left to go to the office, was Stephen and Jen still there?
As far as I know, I don't know. I come to find out later when I get a phone call from Jen around 10 o'clock, 9:48 or so. I think it was 9:49. She called me. It lasted for about a minute to ask me if Stephan was with me. I go, no. Well, he's not here. How long has he been gone? Maybe 25 minutes. I said, okay, well, all right, maybe he's out running around, whatever. So then I get a call from her about at 10:17. Don't recall what that conversation was about. Then there was another call, 10:47, and I think, matter of fact, I'm trying to recall what time we talked about his not being there, and then I called back and said, I told her, I said, go down to the lobby. If he was gone for 25 minutes, go down to the lobby. Maybe he's down there. Seemed logical. And then after I hung up, I called her back and said, are your car keys there? And she said, no. I said, okay, interesting. So then I get a call back from her later and saying that the detective had called and said they were going to come over within the hour to visit with them. And I said, okay, I'm on my way. So I left the office and drove over there and thinking, well, he's going to be in a world of hurt if he's not there when they come back because they'll probably put a bolo out on him and then just decide to arrest him because he's wandering around. What's he doing? So
when you got back, was he there?
No, he didn't show up for another 15 or 20 minutes.
Honestly, I could do an entire video about that portion of the timeline because he's basically saying all these things occurred within the space of an hour. She rang him an hour before Stephan is recorded as returning to the hotel. and yet supposedly he contacted her 25 minutes later to check if the keys were there or something, and then he turned up at the hotel about 15 or 20 minutes before Stephan turned up. That all doesn't quite seem to fit within an hour, and I'm sure I've missed a few bits out as well. So definitely something that I think I need to revisit at some point in time. But once again, the timeline is being problematic. I don't know if this is just Chris Stearns and whether he really does have issues with figuring out timelines or what's going on, or whether perhaps Stephan was back at the hotel for half an hour before showing his face with Jen and Chris. But there's some sort of inconsistency here. I do want to point out two things though, which I will come back to. One, Chris Stearns saying that he got up at 6:30 and headed to his offices at 7:30. Bear that in mind, I'll come back to that at the end of the video. And the other thing that I wanted to point out is him saying that he arrived back at the hotel round about 15-20 minutes before Stephan arrived back. Because here's the thing, right from the get-go, it has seemed really odd to me that he would go out to his work early in the morning when he's supposedly there to provide support for Jen and Stephan, and that he's only returning then, supposedly around 10:30 in the morning, long after Jen has rung him and supposedly said Stephan's not here. It doesn't fit with the narrative of him being there to support them. He went there to support them. He spent the night in the hotel when he didn't need to, and then apparently he wasn't overly worried about catching up with them and went off to his work. I can't help wondering if perhaps the whole point of the trip was to... He spoke to police about the key for his storage unit being in the console in his car. And they're like, can you check? And they checked and it was there. And I can't help wondering if all this was kind of perhaps a little bit staged, and that he had actually turned up, given the key to Stephan, and then met him away from the hotel to get the key back, and then they had arrived back at different times. Now, there's no proof of that, and I'm probably reaching a bit, but it's just a suggestion. I just find it interesting that Chris Stearns was supposedly so keen to go to his office that morning when supposedly he was there to support Stephan and Jen, and it was so important for him to support them that he had to actually get there in the middle of the night as opposed to having a decent night's sleep and driving there in the morning. It doesn't add up.
And I had my timeline all screwed up. I thought they parted their room at 3:30 when in fact it was more like 2:30. So I was thinking, gosh, I just went to bed, and then he turned around and got out of there and went down to Northport.
Okay, that aligns with what I just was talking about in terms of if he had arrived at 10 to 2, then allowing for check-in and everything. If he said that he was with them for 10 to 15 minutes, I said roughly 2:30. So now he seems to be using his phone. He seems to actually be making more sense with the timeline, although at the same time, to me that means that there's still probably about a 2-hour gap, or 1.5, 2-hour gap, between when they all supposedly went to bed and when Stephan headed down to Northport. And obviously he had to wait for Jen to fall asleep, but we know what she's like. Supposedly she takes her meds and she's out like a light. So that's interesting. was it actually 2:30 that they all parted ways? Did they only talk for 10, 15 minutes? Or is this 3 o'clock thing that he was harping on about? Were they perhaps actually talking till 3 o'clock in the morning?
The other interesting thing is, as you know, I came up early Wednesday morning, 2 o'clock, checked into the hotel, tucked Steph and Jen into their room and left 2:20, 2:30. I went to bed.
Okay, so that one is the third interview, and it seems that he's locked into a timeline now, saying that he arrived around 2, so we 10 to 2, went to bed around 2:30. So that actually falls in line with the latter comments. So I think we are starting to get a more solid timeline here.
Because like I said, and as Debbie shared, she said the dogs went on full alert around 5 something, but anything could have spooked him, but definitely he wasn't in Northport at that time, so.
And just when you think you've got the timeline narrowed in, it changes again. So now he's saying the dogs went on full alert at 5:15, or around 5, which doesn't fit with the 3:15 or 3:20, whatever it was. But like I said before, I don't think that the dogs going on alert has anything to do with anything. And I suspect that that is just, they threw that in as a distraction, essentially. Because, I mean, Chris Stearns is a smart man. You can hear him doing rationalisation as he is explaining things. And he even says here, but that wouldn't have anything to do with him being there because he wasn't in Northport at that time. So he's doing the math himself and realising, no, well, it doesn't fit in. But he still has to throw it into the narrative. And I just find it interesting that there are these little curveballs thrown into the narrative here and there. And I don't know if it's just because he gets himself confused or if it is an intentional way of trying to just confuse matters.
The amount of time that I had from 2:15 Wednesday morning until 4 p.m., I spent a total of 35 minutes with him, and it was over 3 different occasions.
So that was actually in the interview that he did with Hidden True Crime. Now that was obviously much later, but it seems to align with the latter timeline that he gave. So breaking it all down, for some reason he seems to have, and I suspect that originally when he said 3 a.m, he probably was trying to hide the fact that he had been speeding between Northport and Orlando. I think that's probably all that is behind it. So it seems that he spent about an hour preparing to go to Orlando, and that's something I've discussed in another video. I find it interesting that it took him that long to get ready to leave. But it seems that he then left Northport a little after 12 and arrived at Orlando less than 2 hours later at a bit after 1:50. Then apparently he spoke to Jen and Steph for a little while. They parted ways at around 2:15, 2:30 in the morning, which allows plenty of time for Jen to take her medications, crash out, and for Stephan to then hop in the car and head back down to Northport for whatever purpose he needed to do so. So I'm actually comfortable with that timeline now. I don't know why, other than that he was trying to avoid telling police that he had been speeding. That's the only reason I can think of him originally saying that he left at 3, that he arrived at 3, when he'd actually arrived more than an hour before that. And I think once he had actually spat it out, having read the times off on his phone, without thinking it through, that then he was dumping himself in it, I think after that he was just sticking with the timeline because he's already admitted that he was speeding, essentially. Now, here's the interesting thing with the timeline. So having set in concrete Chris Sterns' timeline, so we can see that from that he was preparing to leave before Jen knew that they were locked out of the apartment. We can also see that he arrived and they all went to bed well within enough time for Stephan to then turn around and head back down to Northport. And here's the thing that I think it is interesting. Chris Sterns talks about getting up at 6:30 the next morning and heading to the office at 7:30. Now, why is this interesting? Think about the timeline for Stephan Sterns being down at Northport, and I'll just pop that back up as a reminder. Now, keep in mind that this timeline is set in concrete. This is based on plate readers. So we know that he arrived about a mile from their house at 6:29 a.m. and then he was recorded again leaving at 7:46. So an hour and a quarter he was in the area close to the home. Look at the times though, 6:29. Now here's the thing. Chris Sterns and Deb Sterns have been married for 30, 40 years, longer. When you live with someone that long, your time, your body clocks tend to be pretty closely aligned. Particularly, this is a couple who have dogs. If you've got dogs, you know that they love their routines, and these dogs are going to want to get up and go outside of a morning. And if you've got one lot of dogs sleeping with Chris and one lot of dogs sleeping with Steph, as soon as one lot of dogs are up, the other lot of dogs are going to want to get up too, right? So to me, him getting up at 6:30 to go to the office, that sounds like that would be like, just what his regular routine is. And this is not a stereotype, this is real. As you get older, you need less sleep. So it's probably normal for him to get up at 6:30. Are you telling me that Deb Sterns was asleep the entire time between 6:29 and 7:46 that Stephan Sterns was in the area? We have this story of the dogs alerting at 3:19 or possibly 5:19. But we know that story's got nothing to do with the narrative at all because we know Stephan wasn't in the area. But we do know he was in the area at 6:29 a.m. Was Deb Sterns already awake? Did Deb Sterns actually let her son into the house? Or was she aware that he was in the house because she was already awake? Was she still asleep at 7:46 when he left the area? Because I feel totally confident that he did in fact go into that house. Like I said, I believe that he went in through the back door because obviously the keypad on the front door was disabled. And if you look at, there's another video that I've done, and you can see that house is surrounded on the back of the house, backs onto a kind of a bushy laneway that's not even a road. And then you've got kind of bushes and trees and everything on one side, and then a house on the other side. It is a very, very isolated block. So it would be very easy to enter that house from the rear of the house and no one would be the wiser. And the fact that that hard drive completely vanished from his computer, even though supposedly he was on his computer just before he left Northport the day that Maddie was having her party. Like I've said before, only one of 3 people could have removed that hard drive. Either Stephan returned to Northport after what he did to Maddie and removed that hard drive and then got rid of it, or Deb or Chris removed the hard drive and got rid of it. The latter doesn't seem as likely. I can't see that once they realised the extent of what their son had done, that they would then want to further incriminate themselves. So to me it seems logical that he would have in fact entered the house during that early morning drive, gone in there, removed that hard drive, possibly removed other incriminating items, and then headed back to Kissimmee. The fact that he left so late makes me question whether or not Deb Sterns was actually awake while he was in the house, in which case surely she would have been aware that he was there. Was she complicit somehow? Just looking at this timeline has actually raised more questions for me than I had earlier. On one hand, it has at least solidified the timeline in terms of what Chris Stearns was saying in terms of when he arrived at the hotel and when he left Northport, etc. And I feel comfortable with that timeline. But now when you have him talking about going to the office at 6:30 or going to the office at 7:30, getting up at 6:30, and we know that the times that Stephan was at Northport was between 6:30 and 7:46, I've got more questions. So I hope this hasn't been too confusing for people. I hope it has perhaps at least narrowed in timelines for you and answered a few questions, even though it's raised some more. So thanks for listening. If you're new to my channel, please subscribe. Also, please hit the like button and also leave a comment below. What are your thoughts on this timeline? I'd be really interested to know what other people are thinking right now about this. So thanks for listening, and I'll catch you in the next one.